Hello and welcome to Think Watercolour. Today I want to talk about timing. Timing is everything with watercolours, and there are some basic principles that every artist needs to know. And they are as follows. You can paint wet onto dry paper. You can paint wet into wet paper. And you can paint damp into wet paper. But you cannot paint wet into damp paper. These are principles and not rules. Experiment and learn if you want to develop as a watercolourist. There are many successful artists who ignore these principles, but they're successful because they understand them. So let me use this quick landscape sketch to explain what I mean about timing. This is Saunders Waterford 300-gram rough paper, and I'm working with my board flat. I've simply indicated a horizon line in pencil as a guide. And I'm going to start with the sky with a mixture of cerulean blue and cobalt blue, and I'm painting wet onto dry. I'm using the side of the brush to paint this blue area of the sky. I just want it to be broken up as if there's a heavy bank of clouds obscuring the blue sky and just a few areas of blue peeking through. So this is wet onto dry. Now while it's still wet, I'm just adding a little bit more colour and pigment into the mix in a few areas that I want to retain a little bit of strength in the colour once it's dry. These colours will dry much lighter. Just mixing up some Naples yellow for the underpainting of the clouds. It's a very watery mix, and this will dry much lighter. I want to try and depict some sort of heavy wintry clouds. So again, I'm painting wet onto dry, but letting the wet paint touch the blue sky in a few places and leaving some areas untouched so that there's a little bit of white showing through as well. I'm going to paint the whole of the sky with this Naples yellow to start with. I'm keeping the paper nice and wet with this. It's a very watery mix. I'm really flooding the paper with water with this Naples yellow mix. As I say, it's a very weak mix. And as you can see from this angle, you can see the reflection of the light on the wetness of the paper. And while it's wet like this, I can then start to add some shadow areas using a mixture of some of the sky colour, some burnt sienna, maybe a touch of yellow ochre, just to start adding wet into wet the shadow areas. And all the while the paper's wet, I can add as much as I want. And what I'm doing here is it's the same sort of value of water to pigment mix as the Naples yellow. So the paint will spread very, very quickly and give some nice soft shadow areas. And the thing with painting wet into wet, you can carry on adding more and more as long as the paper will take it. Just add a little bit of permanent rose into the mix there, just to give it a warmer tint, just for some more shadows. And I'll keep doing this while while the paper's wet until I'm happy with how it might turn out. Just trying to create some shadows underneath the clouds and leave the top part of the clouds a little bit lighter, as if they're getting hit by some sunlight. And as you can see from this angle, the paper is still very, very wet. And this is what timing is all about, making sure you do this sort of thing when you can. If I'd let this dry, even to the point where it was damp and I tried this, I'd end up with lots of cauliflowers. So I'll just keep doing this until I'm happy with it, and then I'll leave it and let it dry. Well, this is the typical stage where the painting looks a little bit messy while it's wet, but once it dries you'll see that all these shadows will blend together and form a nice range of shades in the sky. I've just mixed up a slightly stronger mix, a little bit more pigment to drop in to the clouds, and this will disperse less, so it will retain its strength. So when you're painting wet into wet, the thicker the paint, the less it will spread. So you will retain the areas that you've painted, but they will dry nice and soft. There will be no hard edges as it's wet into wet. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry and then come back. Okay, the sky is now dry, and what I want to do now is paint some distant hills. This is a cool grey mixed with some ultramarine and burnt sienna, just to indicate some distant hills in the background. And I want to demonstrate painting damp into wet now. Just making sure I get that horizon line pretty straight. Just using a damp brush to create a little bit of variety in the hills. Nothing too detailed. Just lifting out with a clean damp brush. Now those hills are still very wet. So I'm just mixing up some Van Dyke Brown with some ultramarine, just for some distant trees. And this is quite a strong mix, lots of pigment. We call it a damp mix. So I'm painting damp into wet now. And you'll notice that the pigment stays pretty much where I've left it, but I do get a nice soft edge at the top to suggest distant tree line. And as I say, because it's a fairly strong mix, less water, more pigment, it's not going to spread and cover up all of the hills, even though they're still very wet. This is all about control and timing, as I said at the beginning of this video. Once you understand these basic principles, you can experiment and mess around and have some fun and see what effects you get. And while that's drying, I'm just going to indicate a farm track or a bridle way, just to put a bit of foreground in. Maybe the fields either side are covered in snow. Again, using the roughness of the paper and the side of the brush just to pick up some of the tooth of the paper, create this dry brush technique in the foreground. It helps to bring the foreground forward. As you can see, the hills in the background look far away because they're painted in a lighter tone. Just going to put a couple of trees in and maybe a fence line to the right, so just to finish the painting off really. I'm going to speed the rest of the video up because the demonstration about timing is, I hope, is fairly clear. The purpose of this demonstration isn't about the subject matter. At the end of the day, it's a made-up scene typical of the English countryside. I'm just using it as a means of showing the basic principles of how watercolours work. Just keep an eye on how wet your paper is when you want to add more colour. If you look at your painting from a low angle, you can usually see how wet the paper is from any light reflection. For the rest of this sketch, it's pretty much all wet on dry paper. I've used Van Dyke brown for the trees and some yellow ochre on the right hand side, all with dry brush techniques, using the texture of the paper to create some depth in the painting. I've used some cobalt blue just to indicate some shadows in the snow on either side as well. It's a very simple idea. As I say, it's not a demonstration of how to paint the country scene. It's all about showing you how timing works with watercolours. The principles are fairly straightforward. I'll reiterate them here, and I'll put them in the description below as well. You can paint wet on dry, you can paint wet into wet, and you can paint damp into wet, but what you should never do is paint wet into damp. You will end up with cauliflowers. However, as I said at the beginning, lots of artists ignore these principles and make paintings to great effect. So have some fun and play with your watercolours. I do hope you found this useful. If you did, do give it a like. It really does help with YouTube. If you're not a subscriber, do subscribe and hit the notification bell for future videos. And once again, thanks for watching.